Brian knew, and the question is, this passage implies blank. So pause, go answer that question real quick, and come right back. The pilot was having a heart attack. Brian had been in the shopping mall with his mother when a man in front of Paisley's store had suffered a heart attack. He had gone down and screamed about his chest. An old man, much older than the pilot. The pilot was having a heart attack, and even as the knowledge came to Brian, he saw the pilot slam into the seat one more time. One more awful time, he slammed back into the seat, and his right leg jerked, pulling the plane to the side in a sudden twist. And his head fell forward, and spit came. Spit came from the corners of his mouth, and his legs contracted up into the seat, and his eyes rolled back into his head until there was only white for his eyes, and the smell became worse. Filled the cockpit, and all of it so fast, so incredibly fast that Brian's mind could not take it in at first, could only see it in stages. The pilot had been talking, just a moment ago, complaining of the pain. He had been talking. Then the jolts had come. The jolts that took the pilot back had come, and Brian sat, and there was a strange feeling of silence and the thrumming roar of the engine. A strange feeling of silence and being alone. Brian was stopped. He was stopped. Inside he was stopped. He could not think past what he saw, what he felt. All was stopped. The very core of him, the very center of Brian Robeson, was stopped and stricken with a white flash of horror, a terror so intense that his breathing, his thinking, and nearly his heart had stopped. Seconds passed, seconds that became all of his life, and he began to know what he was seeing, began to understand what he saw, and that was worse, so much worse that he wanted to make his mind freeze again. He was sitting in a bush plane roaring 7,000 feet above the northern wilderness, with a pilot who had suffered a massive heart attack, and who was either dead or in something close to a coma. He was alone. In the roaring plane with no pilot, he was alone. Alone. Chapter 2. For a time he could not understand. Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead. Then he looked for ways for it not to have happened. Be asleep, his mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep, and your eyes will open now, and your hands will take the controls, and your feet will move to the pedals. But it did not happen. The pilot did not move, except that his head rolled on a neck, impossibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of turbulence. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened, and he had to do something. But he did not know what. Help. He had to help. He stretched one hand toward the pilot, saw that his fingers were trembling, and touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were procedures that you could do, mouth-to-mouth on victims of heart attacks and push their chests, CPR. But he did not know how to do it, and in any case he could not do it with the pilot, who was sitting up in the seat and still strapped in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him, and on the chest, and could feel nothing, no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant that the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Brian said, but did not know what or who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again, hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. It did not dive, but the nose went down slightly, and the down angle increased the speed. And he knew that at this angle, this slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could only see sky. He had to fly it somehow. Had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, beyond anything he could do, and he had to try and fly the plane. He turned back in the seat, facing the front, and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. You pull back on the stick to raise the plane. He knew that from reading. You always pulled back on the wheel. He gave it a tug, and it slid back towards him, easily. Too easily. The plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly up and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, went too far this time, and the plane's nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with the shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up again. Too far, but not as violently as before. then down a bit too much, and up again as before, then down a bit too much, and up again, very easily, and the front of the engine was cowling settled. When he had aimed it at the horizon, and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was, let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think of what to do next. It was a clear blue sky day, with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out of the window for a moment, hoping to see a town or a village, but there was nothing, just the green of trees, endless green, and lights scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying, but he did not know where, had no idea where he was going. He looked at the dashboard of the plane, studied the dials, and hoped to get some help. Hoped to find a compass, but it was all so confusing, a jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said the number 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath that were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what the winds were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70, which he only thought, might be the altimeter. The device that told him his height above the ground, or above sea level. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, but he couldn't remember what or where, or anything about them. Slightly to the left, and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and two knobs. His eyes had passed it over 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the metal, and it hit him. Finally, that was the radio. The radio, of course. He had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say that the pilot was dead. Couldn't think it. He had been trying to use the radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from his jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped into his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot. He had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot. He did not want to reach for him, but he had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel, just slightly, and held them waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset, slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull to get it loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started down in a shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back, too hard again, and the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it under control. When things had settled again, he pulled at the mic cord once more, and at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his own head and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it, had seen him depress the switch at his belt, so Brian pushed the switch and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but heard nothing except his own breathing. So, the next question is a true-false question, and it is, Brian used the headset to call for help. True or false? So go answer that question real quick and come right back. Panic came then. He had been afraid, had been stopped with terror of what was happening, but now panic came and he began to scream into the microphone, scream over and over, "Help! Somebody help me! I'm in this plane and I don't know. And he started crying with the screams, crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down and then back up. But again he heard nothing but the sound of his own sobs in the microphone, his own screams mocking him, coming back into his ears. The microphone. Awareness cut into him. He had used a CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. He had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. He reached down to his belt and released the switch. For a second, all he heard was the whoosh of the empty airwaves. Then, through the noise and static, he heard a voice. "Whoever is calling on this radio net, I repeat, release your mic switch. You are covering me. You are covering me. Over." It stopped and Brian hit his mic switch. I hear you. This is me." He released the switch. "Roger, I have you now." The voice was very faint and breaking up. Please state your difficulty and location and say over to signal the end of transmission. Over. Please state my difficulty, Brian thought. God, my difficulty? I'm in a plane with a pilot he can't fly, and I don't know how to fly. Help me, help. He turned his mic off without ending transmission properly. There was a moment's hesitation before the answer. Your signal is breaking up, and I lost most of it. Understand. Pilot, you can't fly. Correct. Over. Brian could barely hear him now. Heard mostly noise and static. That's right. I can't fly. The plane is flying now, but I don't know how much longer. Over. Lost signal. Your location, please. Flight number, location, ver. I don't know my flight number or location. I don't know anything. I told you that. Over. He waited, but there was nothing. Once, for a second, he thought he heard a break in the noise. Some part of a word. But it could have been static. 2, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. The plane roared and Brian listened, but heard no one. Then he hit the switch again. So, you got 2 more questions real quick. How often did Brian use the radio to call for help? Go ahead and answer that one, as well as, if Brian is an expert at flying a Cessna 406. Is this question true or is it false? Let's go answer those real quick and come right back. I do not know the flight number. My name is Brian Robeson, and we left Hampton, New York, headed for the Canadian oil fields to visit my father. And I do not know how to fly an airplane. And the pilot, he let go of the mic. His voice was starting to rattle, and he felt as if he might start screaming at any second. He took a deep breath. If there is anybody listening who can help me fly a plane, please answer. Again, he released the mic, but heard nothing but the hissing of noise in the headset. After half an hour of listening and repeating the cry for help, he tore the headset off in frustration and threw it to the floor. It all seemed so helpless. Even if he did get somebody, what could anybody do? Tell him to be careful? All so hopeless. He tried to figure out the dials again. He thought he might know which was speed. It was a lighted number that read 160. But he didn't know if that was actual miles an hour or kilometers, or if it just meant how fast the plane was moving through the air and not over the ground. He knew airspeed was different from ground speed, but not by how much. Parts of books he'd read about flying came to him. How wings worked, how the propeller pulled the plane through the sky, simple things that would help him now. Nothing could help him now. An hour passed. He picked up the headset and tried again. It was, he knew, in the end, all he had, but there was no answer. He felt like a prisoner, kept in a small cell that was hurtling through the sky at what he thought to be 160 miles an hour. Headed, he didn't know where, just headed somewhere until, there it was. Until what? Until he ran out of fuel? When the plane ran out of fuel, it would go down, period. Or he could pull the throttle out and make it go down now. He had seen the pilot push the throttle in to increase speed. If he pulled the throttle back out, the engine would slow down and the plane would go down. Those were his choices. He could wait for the plane to run out of gas and fall, or he could push the throttle in and make it happen sooner. If he waited for the plane to run out of fuel, he would go farther, but he did not know which way he was moving. When the pilot had jerked, he had moved the plane, but Brian could not remember how much or if it had come back to its original course. Since he did not know the original course anyway, and could only guess at which display might be the compass, the one reading 342, he did not know where he had been or where he was going, so it didn't make much of a difference if he went down now or waited. Everything in him rebelled against stopping the engine and falling now. He had a vague feeling that he was wrong to keep heading as the plane was heading. A feeling that he might be going off in the wrong direction, but he could not bring himself to stop the engine and fall. Now he was safe, or safer than if he went down. The plane was flying. He was still breathing. When the engine stopped, he would go down. So he left the plane running, holding altitude, and kept trying the radio. He worked out a system. Every 10 minutes, by the small clock built into the dashboard, he tried the radio with a simple message. I need help. Is there anybody listening to me? In the times between transmissions, he tried to prepare himself for what he knew was coming. When he ran out of fuel, the plane would start down. He guessed that without the propeller pulling, he would have to push the nose down to keep the plane flying. He thought he may have read that somewhere, or it just came to him.